You know, Clifton Hill is a pretty amazing street. It's pretty much the height of materialism in Canada. And there are some very great achievements there, and signs of long lasting security, power, and control as you walk down the street. But you know, there's still this one thing at the end of the street that makes the whole of Clifton Hill seem like cheap entertainment. But hold that thought for a moment while I ask something very important. Do I trust God? Well, yeah, of course I do. I love him, I believe in him, I trust him to provide for my needs, and I know that my needs, or what I think are my needs, don't always line up with what he says I need, and I accept that. But is that stuff that I just say? I mean, how do I know that I trust him? More importantly, how does he know that I trust him? I mean, I live in a pretty fantastic country. I have a job for money, I have a school for knowledge, I have a family for support, I have a church for guidance, I have a wife for love, I have things for comfort, I have a government for protection and law, I have a banker that plans for my future, I have an insurance company that hedges my investments. And with all that, I guess I have to ask myself, do I really need God? Or what do I need him for? So, do I really trust God? Or do I just think I do? We've been talking about God for the last few months, and discussing how our perceptions of God are sometimes very small compared to the real, living, true God. And now we come to the aspect of God as provider. And we have to ask if we have a big enough perception of God to trust him for anything in any circumstance. So what happens when all that security fades away? What happens when the bank account is drained, when the family members move away, when the church fails us, when our marriage falls on rocky ground, when we get rejected by a school, and when our insurance finds a loophole? Do we still sense God's security? Do we still trust him? If all our hope for a secure life is placed in things other than God, what happens? That's the question. The reality is that we are all insecure. We all long for a sense of security. We strive for control over our future. We plan and manage until we find a sense of comfort and can relax. In the US, they call this the pursuit of happiness. And this is the right of all people, to be able to fight for their right to be in control, to be content, and to be safe. Now, C.S. Lewis once wrote a book called Out of the Silent Planet. In this book, Lewis describes a planet that has been unhindered by the effects of sin. The people on this planet have not been tempted to disobey God, and therefore live in perfect harmony with him. In this book, the land on the planet is always in a constant state of shifting. The forms of the land are never the same, and due to this, it is impossible to stay in one place, to find security in one place, or to build up possessions for the future. You can't very well build a house on this land, for it'll fall apart the next day due to the shifting of the land. The people in this land are completely dependent on God's providing hand. But they don't blink an eye, because they have never had reason to think that they would not be safe. But on this planet, there is one piece of fixed land. And God has asked his people on this planet not to spend more than a day on this fixed land. Something that the people on this land never thought of needing to do until a tempter arose. So what's Lewis's point? His point is that though we are managers of all that God gives us, and though we are responsible to make good and wise investments for our future and the future of those we are responsible for, the temptation for us is always there to trust the things that we are managing more than trusting God who gives us those things. We are always faced with finding our security either in God or making idols of the things that God gives us. For the people of Lewis's planet, the temptation was always to trust the fixed land, putting their possessions on it so they could accumulate more and more, rather than trust God to give them their needs one day at a time. And that reminds me of something the Israelites faced while they were in the desert. God said he would provide manna in the desert for them one day at a time. But they complained and tried to hoard food. They didn't trust that God would provide for them each day. For us, the temptation is to trust our money, our homes, our family, and our things for blessings, rather than actually trust God who gives us these things. Some Christians argue that God always wants us to be wealthy. And though I think that his wisdom will often lead to wealth, I also know that he values your trust more than your wealth. And if you begin to idolize anything but him and seek security in anything but him, he will test you and remove the idols from your life. God is much more concerned with the attitude of our heart and the orientation of our heart being towards him than he is our position, our status, and our security in life. God wants you to find security in him and know that he is always in control, for this is the reality, and anything else is a lie. And beyond that, when we do find our security in God, and God is able to prove himself and provide for us even through tough times, his glory is shown that much more. In fact, trusting God is central to the Christian faith. Proverbs 3:5 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart." Psalm 44 says, "Blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust." Romans 15:13 says, "May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him." And Matthew 6:31-34 says, "So do not start worrying, saying, 'What shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear?' For the pagans run after all these things. And your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." Peter Shackle says, "The temptation we face is that by seeking as much control over our present and our future as possible, thus leaving as little as possible to chance or change, we have less need to put our trust in God, less need to rely on and find our security in God." This is how it works. I can be walking down the road of life and trusting God with each step that I take. One day, I trust him to a point that leads me to getting married. The next day, I trust him to a point that leads me to buy a home. The next day, I trust him to a point that leads me to completing my master's. And the next day, I trust him to lead me to a point where I have a child. And then the next day, I begin to reflect on what God has given me. And so I look back and I see my child, but I begin to think that that child, not God, will care for my needs in my old age. And I look at my home and I think, that's my retirement plan. I can retire now, and I don't need to think about what God has planned for me in later years in life. I then begin to see my wife as the ultimate source of love, rather than seeing God's love come through her. And I see my school as the ultimate source of my ability to maintain employment and thus income, rather than trusting God to care for me one day at a time and show me exactly what it is that he wants me to do and where he wants me to be for his kingdom. And suddenly, these things that God has blessed me with begin to blind me from the future that God has in store for me. And so God thus has to break through these barriers and take my security away in order to show me the ultimate future that he has for me. Joy Davidsman says this, "Christ never offered us security. He left that to the politicians. Caiaphas probably offered lots of it. Christ told us to expect poverty, humiliation, persecution, and pain, and to know ourselves blessed through accepting them. The good news out of Nazareth was never reassuring news by this world's standards. For a long time, we have been trying to make the best of both worlds, to accept Christianity as an ideal and materialism as the practice. And in consequence, we have reached a spiritual bankruptcy. Worldliness, we might well admit, doesn't seem to be working so well. Perhaps it is time to revive otherworldliness. Perhaps Christ was not only a lofty idealist counseling in impractical perfection, but also the Son of God. And perhaps not only the Son of God, but a practical counselor who knew what he was talking about when he talked of heaven. Perhaps it is not enough to worship him, flatter him, give his preachers money, and decorate his altar. Perhaps we ought also obey him. Powerful statement, eh? But I don't want you to get me wrong. Shackle says this: what kind of God do we believe in? God could have created a universe in which our needs are provided for entirely through prayer and faith. But he didn't. We are left the responsibility and privilege of contributing to the process of working today and planning for the future. We must take prudent measures towards security, locking the doors of our houses or apartments, for example, and saving some of our income, as well as giving a portion to charity. While at the same time, we must guard carefully against making an idol out of security. And what Shackle is saying is what Paul was also telling Timothy to do when he said these words: command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Paul knew that Timothy had rich people in his congregation, just like we are rich people in our world. And he tells Timothy to encourage his rich congregation not to idolize the security God has given them, and instead continue to use it to glorify the one who truly brings security, Jesus Christ. So now back to Clifton Hill. You see, at the end of Clifton Hill is Niagara Falls, and the sheer power that exists here shows us that no matter what we can achieve when we trust in material gains, God will always have billions and billions of times more power and control than we could ever imagine.